Happy Memorial Day, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Call of Duty World at War Final Fronts for PlayStation 2. This is a first-person shooter developed by Rebellion and published by Activision in November of 2008, actually a few days prior to the mainline Call of Duty World at War, which I've already covered on the channel. Some might think of this as the PlayStation 2 port of World at War, but it really doesn't have much of anything to do with World at War. I mean, sure, it is set in World War II, and they do use some characters that are in World at War, but you're not going on the same missions that were in World at War. This one doesn't even have an Eastern Front campaign at all, and unlike in World at War, where Treyarch's violence and brutality fetish was on full display, Final Fronts not only doesn't have any blood and gore in it at all, thus resulting in getting the T rating from the ESRB, but it's also considerably lighter in tone. This one plays out more like a very standard war movie or war first-person shooter, as opposed to what we got in the mainline World at War by Treyarch, which was trying really hard to be dark and gritty, only it was constantly failing miserably at that because everything it was doing was so utterly ridiculous it was basically impossible to take it seriously. Now, of course, I'll discuss what that change in tone does later on in the video, but suffice to say, when Final Fronts was originally released, it wasn't very well received. It did get some criticism for its general gameplay elements and such, which I'll talk about later, but a lot of people just didn't really have this one on their radar at all. I mean, it was a PS2 game released in 2008. The new generation of consoles had been out for a couple of years at that point, and everybody was firmly rooted in that, as opposed to going back and playing something on the PS2. It was just considered to be outdated and irrelevant. But just because a game is released on a previous generation console, even though we're well within a current generation, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worth taking a look at. So let's just go ahead and start delving right into this thing and see what exactly we're dealing with here, and whether or not it's actually worth playing. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which does not run on the same engine that powered World at War on PC, Xbox 360, and PS3. It runs on a completely different engine. Not only one that is considerably less capable than what the baseline World at War was using, but one that is really stretched to its absolute limits on the PlayStation 2. It is painfully obvious that this game is really exceeding what the PS2 is capable of doing, and even then, it still looks like garbage. Very low texture quality, lots of jagged edges, there's only lip movements in cutscenes. If you're actually in-game and you look at someone who's supposed to be talking, their mouth doesn't move at all. The first-person weapon animations are horrible, the character animations as you're just running around shooting stuff and such don't look very good either, and it certainly doesn't help when they start spazzing out constantly because the physics system starts glitching out. Sometimes enemies will just pop into existence right in front of you. Sometimes you'll shoot an enemy and they will just vanish entirely, not even just hitting the ground in a death animation or anything. And while at least the game has more color than the baseline World at War did, that doesn't count for much when the game absolutely struggles to hit 30 frames per second all the time. Most of the time, it's more around 20 frames per second, and sometimes it'll drop even below that, and that is just embarrassingly bad. And if it weren't for some other issues the game has that I'll outline more when I get to the gameplay section, that would actually render the game downright unplayable. But oh, don't worry, we'll get there eventually. As far as the visuals are concerned, however, it's just a pretty pitiful display, and when you move over into the sound design, things really don't get any better. In fact, they arguably get worse, because the sound mixing is absolutely horrible in this game. It's like the people who were in charge of the sound design had absolutely no idea what they were doing. The sounds of warfare will just completely drown out the voices, and the gunfire and explosions have basically no impact to them, so most of what you're hearing is actually in the background, not what you're actually doing. When you can actually hear what you're doing, you'll notice the gun sounds are pretty wimpy, and the explosion sounds don't really have much impact behind them. You'll notice the audio quality is so low that PlayStation 1 games sound better than it. And when you can actually hear what people are saying, you'll notice the voice acting is middling at absolute best. And it certainly doesn't help that when you move over into the European campaigns and you start fighting the Germans, you'll notice, if you're familiar with Call of Duty 1 and 2 anyway, that they just ripped all of those voice lines from Call of Duty 1 and 2. And as if all of that weren't bad enough, even though Sean Murray was the composer for both this And for the actual mainline World at War, Final Fronts doesn't just use music from World at War. Instead, it has a few tracks that are more or less like what you heard in World at War, but most of it just sounds like a really generic World War II game soundtrack. In other words, unlike World at War, which at least had a fairly memorable soundtrack despite being kind of tone deaf for what they were going for, Final Front's soundtrack just sounds like every other World War II shooter you've ever played. And you have to keep in mind that by the time World at War released, and of course World at War Final Fronts released, pretty much everybody was sick to death of World War II shooters. So having the soundtrack basically being like every other World War II shooter you've ever played except for a handful at best of tracks was just a massive detriment at the time. It's obviously mellowed out over time as we've had fewer and fewer World War II shooters over the years, but that's really not saying much, and when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that is an absolute mess. But as much of a mess as the presentation can be, what really matter here and what might ultimately save this thing are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is, well, it's just World War II. There's really not a whole lot to it. They do follow some of the same lines from World at War in PC, Xbox 360, and PS3 context, but that really only goes as far as the Pacific campaign, where you take on the role of Private Joe Miller, who is not actually the same character as you play in the Pacific campaign of Call of Duty World at War on PC, Xbox 360, and PS3. But you do fall under the leadership of Sergeant Roebuck, and you are also accompanied by Private Polonsky, who is also in World at War, but they don't really go any further with it than that. All Roebuck really does is bark some orders at you, and Polonsky occasionally complains about some things, but they're not really characters. They're just named soldiers that happen to have more lines than the generic guys you're running across. Aside from this very pared down and very sanitized Pacific campaign that follows roughly the same ideas as what you saw in World at War, apart from the tone, of course, the other major chunk of the campaign is actually set in the Battle of the Bulge. Again, because apparently we haven't done that enough. I mean, it is certainly a nice change of pace from the very dull Pacific campaign, but once you go into the Battle of the Bulge, you're doing the same kind of things you've done in many, many other first-person shooters set during the Battle of the Bulge, with the only real exception being a turret sequence where you control the turret of a Sherman tank as your tank rolls around and supports infantry and such like that. It's only for one level, though, and it's, again, only a turret sequence, as opposed to World at War on PC, Xbox 360, and PS3, where you actually drive vehicles. So the turret sequence is obviously pretty lame by comparison to the mainline entry, but the rest of the Battle of the Bulge campaign takes place between two perspectives, where you're playing as Private Sharp of the British Airborne, or Private Gibson of the US 80th Infantry Division. The action during the Battle of the Bulge, of course, takes place in Bastogne, and then once you've gotten through that, then it's on to the Rhine, where you'll control the British as they capture the town of Wesel, and the Americans as they take over Braunau am Inn. After all of that, it's back to the Pacific for two missions, where you'll be trying to capture Okinawa as Private Miller again, and after you've completed those missions, you've completed the campaign mode. The whole thing lasts about 3 to 4 hours depending on your difficulty setting, and for context, I played through the game on the hardened difficulty, that is the second highest difficulty, and after I'd reviewed the footage, it took me around 4 hours to finish the game. I have seen some people completing it in right around 3 hours though, most likely playing it on a lower difficulty setting. That said, those 3 to 4 hours, depending on your difficulty setting, are spent doing the same kinds of things you'd been doing in countless World War II shooters up to that point. You'll storm a position, you'll get on a turret, you'll have to destroy AA guns, you'll have to repel enemy counterattacks, you'll have to grab the Panzerschreck or grab the bazooka and take out the enemy tanks. And of course, you'll have to stand around and wait for your NPC allies to decide that now is the appropriate time to open the door that leads to the next area. It is all extremely linear, to the point where it's actually the most linear of any Call of Duty game I've played to date. I mean, even though all of the other Call of Duty games are certainly linear, they'll give you some room to maneuver. You'll be able to flank enemies, you'll be able to try some slightly different ways of going about things, even though you're ultimately trying to complete the same objective. And while you may not have all that many options, you at least have some freedom to move around a combat arena. In World at War Final Fronts, on the other hand, not only do you have to do exactly what the game wants you to do at any given point, the game makes absolutely no attempt to hide any of this behind scripting or even just gameplay. You'll go into an area and you will know exactly where you need to go and exactly what you need to do, because there's only one way to go and only one thing to do. You'll walk into an area and see, say, a Panzerschreck sitting on the wall, and you'll be like, oh, we're gonna have tanks. And then, sure enough, tank shows up, you need to grab the Panzerschreck, and then you need to take out the tank. Or you'll go into an area to see a scoped rifle sitting on the ground, and you'll be like, oh, this is going to be a sniping section. They're going to tell me to pick that up and snipe some random target. And that's exactly what they do. You'll go into an area, and your guys start to congregate in a specific area, and you'll notice a door over there, and you'll be like, oh, we're going to have to wait for one of my guys to kick down that door before we can proceed. And I guarantee you we're just going to have to hold off waves of enemies until eventually the game decides that I've diminished enough of their forces in order to continue on. You will notice enemies spawning in a sort of clown car manner, where they'll just start pouring out of a single area over and over and over again, and if you hang back and you just keep shooting at them, then they'll just keep respawning no matter what you do. You have to go to a specific spot in order to stop that respawn trigger from happening. And don't get me wrong, I understand that I can easily spot those kinds of things just by nature of having played a lot of games like this, but Final Fronts does it in such a way to where it, again, makes no attempt to hide any of this, so even if you weren't familiar with this type of first-person shooter, you would still be able to notice these things almost immediately, and any kind of immersion you would have had is completely shattered. And it certainly doesn't help that the game punishes you for not doing what it tells you to do in the specific way it tells you to do it. To give you a prime example, during the British campaign, there is a certain section where one of your NPC allies goes and plants a demo charge on an enemy tank, and then you have to shoot that demo charge in order to detonate it. And you will actually get the objective marker saying, you need to shoot this thing, and then you'll say to yourself, oh, well, okay, then you just target and shoot it, and then it fails the mission. And you go, wait a minute, I did what you told me to do, why didn't this work? And then you go back and you listen over the sound of all of the ambient noise drowning everything out. Your commanding officer says, wait till I tell you to shoot. But the game gives you the objective marker before you are told to shoot. So even though the objective is actually active, it doesn't matter because the sound cue hasn't played yet. Not that it's certain you'll actually hear that sound cue given how bad the sound mixing is. This kind of shoddy design just drags the game down, and that effect is only amplified when you actually start looking at the mechanics themselves. You see, on paper, this has basically everything you would expect in a Call of Duty game at that point. So you have a 2-weapon limit, you have regenerating health, you have a button dedicated for frag grenades, you have one dedicated for smoke grenades, you have the ability to aim down sights, and of course if you aim down sights you're going to be considerably more accurate than if you try shooting from the hip. Unlike with Call of Duty 4 and World at War, the melee attack in this is back to what you saw in Call of Duty 3 and earlier, where if you click the right stick, then it will lash out with whatever weapon you've got for just a quick bash attack. You have a change stance button that allows you to quickly go between crouching and standing, and if you hold the button down then you'll go prone, and you also have the ability to run faster by clicking the left stick while you move. And those of you who've played a Call of Duty game before will look at those and say, okay, yeah, that all checks out, that's exactly what I expect from Call of Duty, what's the problem here? Well, the problems are in the implementation of all of these things, as well as other aspects of the game, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Let's start with how you as a player can interact with the game, so the basic controls and shooting and such like that. There is not a single mechanic in this game that is not off in some way. For example, to aim down your sights, you hold L1, not L2, like you would expect, especially in 2008. No, you hold L1, and your shoot button is R1. Your R2 is throwing frag grenades, and your L2 is throwing smoke grenades. For those of you who may not be familiar with PlayStation controllers, let me give you an example based on the Xbox 360 controller, which a lot more people who watch my channel will probably be familiar with. that would be the equivalent of pressing the left shoulder button to aim down sights and the right shoulder button to shoot, the right trigger to throw your frag grenade, and the left trigger to throw your smoke grenade. Now, this is the kind of thing I would expect to see in, say, a PlayStation 1 game, or a very early PlayStation 2 game. By the time this game came out in 2008, they definitely knew better. You might think to yourself, oh, that's not that big of a deal, just change the controls. You can't. Because apparently, putting more than one controller layout in the game is completely unreasonable, even though that had been a standard feature of not only first-person shooters on console, but just about any console game for well over a decade by that point. Not necessarily a deal-breaker, but certainly very annoying. Once you get past that, you'll realize pretty quickly that the button for throwing back a grenade that's thrown at you is the same button as the general interact button, which is also used for picking up weapons and such. This one is a bit odd, but not really all that big of a deal, until you realize that other use button functions will interfere with your ability to throw back enemy grenades, and on top of that, even if there's nothing to interfere with your ability to throw the grenade back, sometimes the button just decides it doesn't want to work. Not that it matters all that much, because the grenade timers are so short that even if you do get the indicator, then chances are when you're throwing it back, it'll just still go off in your face and you'll have to restart from the last checkpoint. While I'm on the subject of grenades, if you try to cook grenades, you'll find that they're considerably less effective than if you were to just toss them out by just quickly pressing the button instead of just holding it down to try to cook it. Because for some utterly baffling reason, the grenade physics just make no sense in this game. And when I say it makes no sense, I mean I have thrown grenades at enemies and there has been a wall between them and the grenade and they still died from it. And I've also thrown grenades at enemies, they've been basically standing right on top of it and it did nothing to them. By the same token, I have had grenade indicators show up and taken absolutely no damage from them when they've gone off, even though they're pretty close to where I'm standing. And I've also had grenades go off that were nowhere near where I was standing. I didn't have a grenade indicator, and yet I still died from them. I have absolutely no idea what's going on with that. And I also have absolutely no idea what's going on with the smoke grenades either, because it seemed like half the time I threw a smoke grenade, it did nothing. The enemy was still able to shoot me through the smoke with pinpoint accuracy, so at that point, why even bother with the smoke grenades? Even the simplest and most fundamental mechanics of first-person shooters don't work properly in this thing. You'll go to aim at enemies, and you'll find that the aiming feels really weird. Like, the sensitivity is just all over the place no matter what you set it to. You find out pretty quickly that that's the sticky aim system at work. That is basically this game's word for aim assist. You can turn that off if you want, but it turns off all aim assist if you do that. If you leave it on, then when you go to aim down your sights, it will draw your sights toward whatever the nearest enemy is. Or at least what it thinks the nearest enemy is, and then you might have to make some adjustments if that enemy starts moving around on you. This does work to a point, but you really can't get much precision out of it, and a lot of the time it will still try to lock onto enemies that are actually behind cover and you have no chance of hitting, but you just don't realize it because the graphics are so muddled you can't really tell. And even if you are dead on with your sights, you're aiming directly at an enemy, a lot of the time you will still miss them, because even when you're aiming down sights, the game has cone of fire mechanics. The only weapons that do not have cone of fire mechanics are the bolt-action rifles. Everything else, you can be aiming directly at an enemy, and your shots will go around them anyway. There is an exception to this, which is the shotgun, or trench gun as this game calls it, which you can just point in the general direction of an enemy and it will probably hit them. In fact, I found that the shotgun was arguably the most effective weapon in the game, precisely because I didn't really need to worry as much about the sticky aim system getting in my way. Because when you're not aiming down your sights, the sticky aim system will still kick in when your crosshair gets close enough to an enemy, and it will actually slow your sensitivity down, so it'll sort of soft lock onto an enemy in this until you power through that, and then your sensitivity will go back up until you find another enemy that the sticky aim system will try to latch onto. That ends up being a pretty big mess if you're trying to get any kind of precision or fast aiming out of this, and so when you get a shotgun that you just need to point in the general direction of the continent the enemy's standing on, that makes things a lot easier. And the worst part is, if you turn sticky aim off entirely, it removes all aim assist. Period. So then you're relying entirely on your own aiming abilities, at which point you really start to notice the issues with the actual aiming controls. Namely that there's some odd dead zones with the controls, so that even if you have the sensitivity set to something that ordinarily would work properly in a console shooter, you still have to compensate for the controls, and you're still not going to get any kind of speed or precision out of them. Not that you can get any kind of speed or precision out of gamepad controls without aim assist anyway, but that's beside the point. It gets even more awkward when you start to factor in recoil, because if you go into a first-person shooter, you expect some kind of recoil, both when you're firing from the hip and when you're aiming down your sights. The problem is that while there is recoil when you're firing from the hip in this, and it's a surprisingly substantial amount of recoil, when you go to aim down your sights, there is no recoil at all. The animation will show that there's sort of recoil, but your view position does not change at all. It just stays perfectly level with whatever you happened to aim at in the first place. Thus, literally all of the inaccuracy of your weapon is not handled by the recoil pushing the gun around, it's handled by those cone of fire mechanics, which means that even if you do make use of the sticky aim system and you basically lock onto an enemy, you are aiming directly at them, and you're noticing that you're not getting any kind of recoil, your shots are not going off target because your gun is jumping around or anything. It doesn't matter, because it's up to basically random chance as to whether or not your bullet is actually going to go on target. So because of this, the mere act of trying to aim and shoot at things is a pain in the ass, but even worse than that, the damage modeling is really weird. I've had plenty of instances where I dropped an enemy with a single shot, and yet I've also had plenty of instances where with the same weapon shooting the enemy in the same spot, it took numerous rounds to bring them down, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of rhyme or reason why. By the same token, I've had enemies shoot me once and I dropped instantly from seemingly full health, and I've also had enemies shoot me multiple times and my screen's turned all red and everything, and I still haven't gone down. In fact, the damage the player takes is difficult to determine because you'll get a message that pops up on the screen saying that you need to find cover before you take more damage, and it's hard to tell exactly how much damage you're taking because you really don't get any indicator of it until you've taken a lot of damage, at which point you'll get the red outline on the screen. And what makes that so much worse is that a lot of the time you'll take damage from an indicated direction, you'll turn to look that direction, and there'll be nothing there. It'll just be a wall that you're standing in front of, and you'll go, wait, what just happened? And I've had plenty of situations where I've been up against a wall with no way for enemies to see where I was, and I was still taking hits from them through the wall. But only some walls, and I could never actually shoot through any walls myself. I have no idea what was going on with that. And that sort of thing even happens with melee attacks. You'll go to throw a melee attack at an enemy, and you may or may not hit them. It's a roughly 5% chance that you'll actually hit them, at least from my experience, because I would throw melee attack after melee attack at enemies, and they'd be right in front of me, I'd be aiming at them, and it, for whatever reason, wouldn't hit them. And then other times I would throw melee attack and they'd just drop instantly. There was just no consistency with it whatsoever. So when you look at all the mechanics, even on a fundamental level, they just don't work properly most of the time. And even once you get past that, there will be the ultimate deal breaker with this thing. Not only is it extremely linear to the point where it's just obnoxious, not only do the game mechanics themselves just not work properly, but the enemy AI, and the friendly AI for that matter, is so stupid it's basically brain dead. Enemies will just stand there and let you mow them down. They'll stand there and stare at their buddies as they get mowed down and do absolutely nothing about it. Both friendlies and enemies will be standing directly in front of the target they're attacking, and with nothing in between them, with barely even, say, 3 or 4 feet in front of them, they're still not able to hit each other. And then, of course, there are the Japanese enemies that will just bonsai charge you constantly for no discernible reason. Of course, I say bonsai charge you as in the player, but that doesn't actually happen a lot of the time. A lot of the time they will run directly at you, and then just abruptly change direction and go after one of your allies, and there's no discernible reason for it. So under normal circumstances, the AI really doesn't pose much of a threat to you at all. It's just when you play completely recklessly and just run directly into enemy fire that you're really going to run into problems, and even then, a lot of the times, because the damage modeling is so inconsistent, you can get away with doing that. And while I certainly died quite a few times while I was messing around with this thing, most of the time it actually wasn't because the game was especially difficult, it's because it just pulled some weird bullshit out of absolutely nowhere. I would just be walking around with nothing attacking me, and then all of a sudden I would just drop dead out of nowhere. I would be nowhere near an enemy grenade, but it would still go off and kill me instantly. I would be basically at full health and just instantly die from a single shot from an enemy without having any indication of what the hell that was. For a while I thought that playing the game a bit more slowly and methodically and using cover would help mitigate some of those issues, but it really didn't help at all. So eventually I just said, you know what, screw it, I'm just gonna play this thing however I feel like playing it at any given point, and that ended up being running around guns blazing half the time, and the other half of the time just standing back behind cover and picking off enemies from a distance as they continually spawned in. The end result of all of this is that the single player portion of this game is just absolutely miserable to play. It is an unmitigated disaster on all fronts. I mean, it just doesn't work properly most of the time, and even when it is working properly, it's just awful. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, DW, that's fine, the single player is awful, but what about the multiplayer? I mean, you can't really play it anymore, but obviously, with this being a Call of Duty game after Call of Duty 4, multiplayer would be a big deal, right? Nope! This game had absolutely no multiplayer at all. It is only single-player campaign. That means that you get 3 to 4 hours of gameplay, and that's it, for a full-priced PS2 game in 2008. It just reeks of Activision having this compulsive need at the time to shove Call of Duty games on every single platform they possibly could, just to try to squeeze some extra money out of all of the marketing they were putting into the main release. But this goes beyond simply being a cheap and obvious cash grab. It is legitimately impressive just how bad this game is. If it were just the pathetic campaign design and the awful AI, that would be bad enough to put it into 1 out of 5 territory. But this goes further than that. It doesn't even really function properly as software, because its fundamental mechanics don't even work properly. And as such, this is going to be the lowest rated Call of Duty game to date, at a 0.5 out of 5. Do yourself a favor, even if you are an absolute diehard fan of Call of Duty, avoid World at War Final Fronts like the plague. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.